I was like, I don't get it, man. It's supposed to be this incredible Shen, powerful, blah, blah, blah thing. But when I got the extracts and I took that for the first time and you just feel it calming your system down, you go, that's what they were talking about.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, mate. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Likewise, it is also a pleasure.
Yeah, awesome. I'm excited for today because, I don't know, like mushrooms and adaptogens and all these things, they're coming up a lot at the moment. I don't know if they're in vogue or not, but they just seem to be kind of everywhere I'm looking, and especially in the health and wellness space, they're becoming a really big thing. And you're the guy, you know so much in this field. So I'm really excited to get into some mushrooms and everything else in that area. However, to kick things off, I like to start with a nice, simple one. What is the sweatiest you've ever been?
What's the sweatiest I've ever been? Really? Well, like I actually have a sauna.
Cool.
At my house. So, that's actually not a simple question. All right. So bad luck. The interesting thing is, man, like when I train, I tend to drink like celery juice as like a form of electrolyte, but it's very, very sodium rich. And so when you have things that are especially the right form of sodium, but sodium in particular helps you sweat, because that's actually one of the ways that, we cool down. That's like we're very different to like a lot of other animals. We actually cool down through sweating, whereas a lot of animals cool down through panting and things like that. And they actually can't do that when they're on the run. I've been reading this book recently called Born to Run, and it's suggesting that we actually have the ability to do what's called persistence hunting, which means that we can actually run an animal until it's exhausted. And it's not really done these days, but they're actually suggesting this is why we evolved from being quadrupedal into being bipedal from an evolutionary perspective, because our co-evolved. They're slightly our ancestors, because we did sort of apparently interbreed with them. The Neanderthals were stronger, smarter, fitter, braver, et cetera, et cetera. So it made no reason as to why we would actually outlive them. So sweating is like a hugely important thing actually to what we do. But yeah, man, I mean, I have a sauna as well. I've sweated pretty heavily in that. Probably my sauna actually, now that I think about it. But when you run and you drink celery, like you sweat hard. And I've recently had a haircut. So it's really awesome to not have my hair going completely in my face and getting in the way when I'm doing sports activities and sweating it out. So,
yeah, nice. Do you ever have celery juice before the sauna?
I used to, man. I actually haven't had a sauna in like over a year. I got really heavily in like 2019 into playing around with the medical medium and what that had to offer. It's kind of like I already knew that celery juice was amazing. Like people like David Wolfe talked about, especially when you're doing cleansing and stuff, that for your dinner you would actually have like, I think it's a third or 2/3 of your juice would be constructed out of either celery or cucumber juice. Right? They're both very, very alkaline. But as far back as like my second raw food teacher, Sapoti Brook, he created this thing called a Kapnak chart. And one of the ways that you would not only alkalize, but also reduce inflammation and increase your sodium levels was with celery juice, because it was one of those ones that hit so many points. So where Anthony Williams comes into his own with the celery juice is that he's already kind of fulcruming off something that has its own power. Whether as a standalone, it's good. I mean, look, I practiced it for, I think solidly for like, it was either 3 or 6 months. I think it was 3 months. And I definitely got certain benefits out of it. But to me, I prefer now to have like celery with other things. But yeah, celery is a phenomenal electrolyte to have if you're going to go into saunas. So yeah.
Yeah, that Born to Run book's really, really fascinating, right? I mean, we can just run and run and run. and continue to do so with that heat response system that is sweating, right?
Yeah. I also found it really interesting because I was talking to a friend of mine. Her father was actually is like a raw vegan athlete, and I've also got another friend who recently, by recently it was 2019. Gosh, time flies, isn't it? He ran up Mount Buffalo, which for those who don't know what that is, that's a very large mountain in Victoria, and he did it 40 times consecutively. Like, he slept at nighttime, and he's turning 60 this year. I actually recently caught up with him. He lives in Bright, which is near where Mount Buffalo is, but he's a freakish athlete. And so there's something to be said about us and our ability to run, because one of the other things they talked about in the book was how, and I'm probably misquoting this a little bit, but like a 64-year-old runner can actually outpace a 20-year-old runner. So it's the only sport where we actually get better over time. But it seems that whether you're a vegan or a meat eater or what, one of the things I think where the paleos have gone a bit skew with is they based it on Neanderthal kind of understanding and methodologies, and that's not actually who we are. So in terms of the expansion of the brain and the consumption of meat and stuff like that, well, that's one part of the theory, certainly. But in order to actually run, your best fuel source is 100% basically carbohydrates. And like raw vegan athletes in the running field tend to excel. Like, I actually looked into a guy whose name, man, it's not jumping to me right now, but he did a project called Running on Raw, where at age 38 he was decided he was wanted to see what he could do on a raw food diet, a raw vegan diet, and he's still running. He's now like 51, and at one point he was like top in the field of like mountain trail running. Probably not like the elite crazy ultra running that's, you know, really set aside for the hardcore nut jobs. But it's really interesting when it's true, man. Like, especially if you've read anything like Dave Goggins' books. I mean, are you an ultra runner, eh?
No.
I thought you were pointing at you.
There's always some kind of going like David Goggins, for example, like there's something in his head that most of us don't have, you know?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, man. Like my best run to date, which was a few days ago, I'm training at the moment. I did actually use a lot of his ideas and techniques, though, because basically I think that I like what he says about the fact you're only at 30% capacity, and that's fine, but you've got to actually calcify the mind and bring that up to speed. So for probably the last quarter of it, I had to just keep saying, don't stop, in my mind, don't stop, keep going, you can do this. You know, that whole kind of like the little steam engine that's going up a hill, or, you know, that adage, I think I can. But in I guess a way that's a little bit more harsh, and because you need that authoritative voice in your head that tells you keep going. But, you know, circling back to adaptogens, that's definitely where they come into play in terms of increasing the stamina of the body and all that sort of thing. So, yeah.
You mentioned just before we kicked off that you're starting to eat a little bit more raw again. When did your health journey kind of begin for you?
Well, you know, it's funny because, like, you know, they say like it's a journey, not a destination. I think that's a really big take home as well, because a lot of people are looking for like this A grade thing, and they get stuck on one particular mentality or another. Just to throw in a completely random and totally irrelevant analogy, I'm a rollerblader, but I've recently like wanting to try different things. And it's funny, like I've got a guy I know who is an incredibly good aggressive rollerblader, which basically means that you go into bowls and you use a particular type of skate. I've got one of my teachers who is a slalom, and she's incredibly good. She actually went and competed last year over in I'm going to say Europe because I don't know. Right? Her and her boyfriend went and competed. But when I say, "Oh man, you've got to try roller skates, so you got to try this, you got to try that," they're just like, "Yeah, no, I'm just going to stick to what I'm going to stick to." So I like to try and keep things really broad, right, and try a whole bunch of different things. So yeah, there's my analogy for that one.
Yeah, no, I like that. Yeah, I think that's important too in health as well. Like my partner and I went raw vegan after fasting last year, and there's a lot of dogma in like ways of living like that, and people, I actually don't like saying, we eat raw vegan, or we, people ask me what I eat. It's like, I just eat mainly fruits, because when you put yourself in a box, then there's this set of beliefs which are kind of cast upon you. And I think that kind of misses the point in health, being open to things and seeing what works for you is the way to go. Similarly to roller skates, right? It's different kind of.
Yeah, look, 100%, man. And, I hope you guys realize I was being kind of tongue in cheek in respect that I'm plugging in all this fitness stuff at the moment because this is what I'm really into. But it's a really big thing to because when I was a raw foodist, like hard out, I was like 100% for like 2 years solid, no matter what. I got really sensitive. I started having like spontaneous spiritual experiences. This does not happen to everybody. I get it. I feel like it was definitely part of my dharma journey, karma, whatever you want to say. And some of it was actually quite ungrounded, but there was this mentality because raw food was in its faddish peak phase at that point where, you would literally go, but I just like, if I have this one thing, I'm not as good as this other person or whatever. And it's really a balancing act. A good example is Paul Bragg. Paul Bragg is actually, the father of health food granddaddy, really, of like health food stores and modern health as we know it. Like between him and Ann Wigmore, who, kind of started the wheatgrass movement and what ultimately became the green smoothie movement, which Victoria Botenko kind of fixed up and made palatable for the modern age. Even Paul would go, and he was extreme. Like I've spoken to like Paul Bragg's followers and they go, dude, I can't do that. Like, he would fast all the time. And that's great. If you can do that, fantastic. And if you're excited about doing that, that's fantastic too. But ultimately, if he felt like eating an egg, he was going to do that. And some of the more balanced people that I follow, like Truth Culkin's being like a really good example, he's primarily like into tonic herbs and he's got a very strict diet, mind you. So like that, and that's important for him. Right? Again, you've got to work out what works for you the best. But basically, he has a very strict diet, but he also understands that at times when he's not primarily eating like either raw vegan or adaptogen based diet, like if he feels the need to eat like some meat or whatever for his jing and his development, he does that. And not getting caught up in the dogma and finding out what's right for you is a really significant and important thing. For the moment, I'm interested in lowering my inflammation. Like it's almost like sometimes it's hard to verbalize this, but there's certain things from my journey, which I still haven't got into, I guess, right, that I just know intuitively. And so I go, all right, my goal's being primarily sports at the moment and pushing it way beyond what people who are educating me and saying I can do. I'm like, okay, well, if I'm going to do that, then I've got to do certain things that I know are going to work. And one of the biggest things is lowering inflammation. And so when you look at where like raw fooding began, I cannot remember the name of the book, but it's essentially talking about how the blood agglutinates when there's a certain percentage of cooked food. Like your blood will actually respond, the white blood cells will respond to the cooked food as though it's actually a foreign invader. And that's one of the reasons why we tend to fall asleep after a big meal. And there is kind of a trick to that too. So this is the thing, it doesn't have to be 100% because if you have, I think it's like 60% or something like that of the calorific, intake of that food is like raw, then the blood doesn't respond in that fashion. But if you understand that from an alkalinity acidity perspective, basically you're increasing your alkalinity and therefore you're lowering your inflammatory responses in the body. And the other one, which I feel drawn to at the moment, taking out, which is cheese, right? Which removes that sort of phlegmatic aspect that cheese can provide. Because a big thing I found, again, when I was like a crazy raw foodist, when I did do one run, I went, oh my God, this is amazing. I'm doing this forever. And then I literally had like raw cream, I think it was either that night or the next night. Because I kind of was like looking at everybody at the time, so I was exploring not raw paleo. I was a raw vegan, but I was interested in this whole concept of like colostrum powder and raw cheeses and stuff. And I did know where I could get raw cream, and it does taste pretty good. It's not like normal cream, but immediately I could feel that inflammatory response in my muscles. And that's not going to be the same for everyone. If you're a very sensitive person, right, you're going to feel these things more than if you're not. So yeah, man, you've got to do what's right for you, and that's going to be different for everybody.
When did mushrooms start to come into your field?
Well, actually, it's funny because I'm sort of twirling with these cards as I talk to you. Back in, I'm going to say 2009 or 10. It was either 2009 or 10. Like the Longevity Now program by David Wolf came out, and I really wanted to participate in it. And so I was like deeply enmeshed in like all things to do with raw food and health advancement. So I pretty much lived on the internet 24/7, learning as much as I could and taking in as much as I could. And I was going to Bali, and one thing that Wolf was talking about with medicinal mushrooms was that if you go to a tropical environment, having a host defense of medicinal mushrooms will actually stop you from getting a lot of these kind of tropical diseases and issues that you can get. We all know when we go to like our close tropical country, Bali, where, people get Bali belly and things like that. So weirdly enough, Paul Stamets, who runs a company called Fungi Perfecti, who, at the time was probably one of the only mushroom companies that was really well known throughout the world, he was going through a brand change. So I didn't really have very much money at the time, but I spent saved up, and I spent like $500 on like as much of his pills as I could. And I remember like taking them and consuming them. And then post that, I guess short story is I didn't get Bali belly. I felt really amazing while I was on them, which is great. Whether it was the mushrooms or not, I actually can't tell you. I was also like on a raw diet. I mean, I was eating durians and raw coconuts and all kinds of amazing stuff. But when I got back, when I started to formulate what would become my first company, I was kind of interested in bringing anything and everything I could to market, which was everything from like companies like Loving Earth that were just sort of starting out. I would buy bulk amounts of like their cacao and their mesquite and their lucuma. And again, being sensitive, I would have these like, it felt like I was downloading stuff from other lifetimes of like being in South America and stuff. So I had this extreme long-term love affair with these superfoods. So I wanted it all, kind of thing. And mushrooms are really, really hard to get. Like, so the fact that I got Paul's ones was a miracle. So it was actually some time before I found another company on iHerb, which, and I just, full disclosure, like I now, there's a big difference, and I'd like to go into that in terms of the difference between what's known as grown on grain or mycelium grown on grain, MOG, right, and fruiting bodies. So the mushrooms that I was playing with in the early days, they really weren't what we're looking for at all. And so the next one, it's funny because people must have known that, because these bottles of mushrooms that I was, selling that I got off iHerb, man, I think it was like one or two customers who'd buy one like every 2 months or something like that. It really wasn't the thing that was feeding my market stall at the time. And the way that I actually kind of found my first source of mushrooms, which also wasn't that amazing, was another company that was bringing some in from the States. See, it's interesting, and this is an important thing to know, is just because it's organic doesn't make it good, right? You really, really want to know. Do you want to jump in about actually mycelium on grain and that first, so that I can make that a bit clearer?
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, okay, cool. So basically, you got to look at this from a marketing perspective, marketing and also like an economy perspective. So if you get a fruiting body such as this, right? So this is a genuine reishi, right? I've got to be really careful because it's actually on the way out. It's quite soft now, but normally it's like this really hard shell. So when you see in a forest, you see like this kind of like ledge sticking out, right, from a dead tree. That's what's it called, a polypore, and usually it's like some sort of Ganoderma. So this is Ganoderma lucidum, but it's quite old. You can see that when this is new, this was like really bright white, and this has obviously got fingerprints on it and stuff, but you can still see it's reflective, right? So lucidum basically means shiny. So that's what that is. So when you get a fruiting body, you've essentially got this marriage between the wood, right, of the decaying tree, and you've got the fungus itself. Now, the fungus itself, this is just the fruiting body. So the fruiting body comes out, right, of the mycelium. The mycelium is this invisible white pithy kind of material. If you've ever kicked a rotting stump, you see that white stuff underneath. That's mycelium. And so the mycelium, which is really what the fungus actually is what's known as a white rot fungus. So it breaks down trees. Like a really quick example is, like close your eyes and imagine like none of the trees in the world had any termites, ants, right, or mushrooms to break it down. Imagine millions and millions of years of fallen trees. Do you know what I mean? Like it's just not going to work for an ecosystem. So really these things break down ecosystems in order to reform them. They're actually significant to the ecosystem for that reason. So that's a fruiting body, but and it's unfortunate I don't actually have a cake to show you, but when you grow mycelium on grain, right, the mycelium is basically like, as I said, that white pithy material, but it's basically taking over the cake, which is usually consistent of like some sort of grain like rye or oats or barley. And if you can kind of imagine that there's like a range of different foods, we now know from what I've said, right, that wood and that structure of the tree really has some good quality nutrients in it. Actually, a good example is Sharga, which is slightly different because it lives on a living host tree, but we know that birch has medicinal qualities. Like birch leaf does, birch bark does, birch syrup does. There's all these aspects of the birch tree, and the Sharga is native only to a birch tree. And so it's like that marriage between the qualities of that wood and the qualities of that mushroom. Whereas on the other end of the scale, let's say we're just trying to grow spores so we can grow mushrooms. We start off with an agar dish. And for those of you guys who don't know what an agar dish is, you might have used them in science class, like a little round dish with like a jelly stuff, which is so tempting to put your finger in, but don't do that because you contaminate it, right? And let's say you grow spores in that. Well, that's like the equivalent of us eating high fructose corn syrup, or if I was being slightly nicer, just like straight up sucrose, which is like what we know is like sugar, like white sugar. So you go from that white sugar, and then the next step up, right, the next carbohydrate step up is this grain. So you grow these mycelium onto this grain medium, right, which are like these cakes. They then overtake that medium. And so that's probably the equivalent of eating McDonald's, right? The mushrooms really want that wood. But where it gets even worse is that it's very difficult to separate that mycelium from the mushrooms. And to be fair, a lot of that grain has been consumed and transformed, but this is where it gets tricky, and I should explain this first. So going back to the agar dish, right, like sugars exist based on carbon chains. So if you imagine you've got a C and you've got a link and you've got another C. So like disucrose, I think that's right, is basically 2 carbon chains, right? So it's very, very simple and quite sweet. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you've got a polypore mushroom, right, which has very, very long chains, which are known as polysaccharides. The longer the chains, it's a non-sweet long chain, highly bonded chain. Right, and so that then makes it much more locked in, much more powerful, much more medicinal in its application. So if we've got grains that we've basically blended down, it will read polysaccharide readings. It'll read and give false readings, which is one of the things that marketeers like to do, is that they'll tell that they've got these high polysaccharide readings, but the polysaccharides aren't the ones that we're looking for, which is actually the B glucans, right, which is what we find in this. I know it's a bit complicated, but it gives you the idea that what you're looking for is fruiting bodies and not these caked up sort of mycelium on grain. So anyway, man, like basically I was bringing in these, and, you know, long story short, there was just this one day, it was like a special mushroom day. I also went out and was hunting another special mushroom that day for the first time. And it was almost like the stars aligned, and I first managed to get, bulk amounts of mushrooms, which were, as I said, nigh on impossible to get into Australia. Fast forward to about 2014, myself and my business partner managed to get like good quality extracts, and especially when you're dealing with something like reishi, because you hear so much touted about reishi. I didn't really get reishi. Like, to be honest, I was really obsessed with Sharga, and I made this like chocolate. It was like a coconut chocolate with honey that was sort of mimicking what Loving Earth was doing. If you've ever had that chocolate coconut butter, I really liked that. So I wanted to make one that was a little bit more medicinal. So I made one which I called Sharga Laga Ding Dong. And there was kind of like a bit of a cult following for that at market and stuff. And it was also a bit of a shtick of mine that I would eat a jar of it a day. So, which, you know, actually wasn't ideal in the end, because really the Sharga I was using wasn't that great. But what was interesting is that the Sharga I was using at the time was probably the most medicinal of the mushrooms I had. So as I said, I didn't get reishi. I was like, I don't get it, man. It's supposed to be this incredible Shen, powerful, blah, blah, blah thing. But when I got the extracts and I took that for the first time, and you just feel it calming your system down, you go, that's what they were talking about. So that's really what began the journey into mushrooms. And once we started to get extracts, we started to learn more, experiment more, and really take them more, man. Like another big thing, going back to what we were talking about people like getting fixated on one idea, people also tend to get fixated on the MD mentality, which is take two and call me in the morning. Well, you might need to take more than that for a period of time, or in some cases less than that, because you're really sensitive and you need to like work your immune system up to it. Just your system up to it, because these things like are really potent. People are used to hearing a whole bunch of hearsay, but when they take some of these things, these adaptogens, which, as you said, they are kind of finding a groove in the market, and I think there's a reason for it, because also going into that whole idea of the journey is that the journey, while it might be, this today, that tomorrow, there does tend to be, and look for this, guys, a thread, right? And for me, that thread was adaptogens. Like, we are, as Teelixir, an adaptogenic-based company, because if you look up adaptogens and learn about adaptogens, and I've actually got, here's my show and tell number 2. Right? So this is a really good book on adaptogens. And, you know, it explains like a whole number of adaptogens and what they do. An adaptogen is basically something that makes your body more bioflexible in a way. So to make it really simple, let's say that you've got high cortisol levels, which is a stress level, right? If they're really high, it'll bring them down. If you've got low cortisol levels, it'll bring them up. It brings everything into harmony and balance, but it takes time to do that. So while some people, you know, may need to take high doses for a while and then reel it back, other people need to take lower doses and then increase it. It's really about finding that balance and equilibrium for each individual. So, yeah.
Mate, that is awesome. Jumping back to the different types you're talking about, grain-fed and wood-fed, I guess, fruiting bodies. How do you actually know when you look?
Oh, log grown, man. Sorry, like I should have said that. Log grown is it, because that's.
Yeah, beautiful. And so, is that something that is marked on packages for medicinal mushrooms?
You know what? Yes, well, it is on ours. And like that's what you want to look for, right? Is basically log grown mushrooms. There is an exception to that rule, which is cordyceps, and we can jump into cordyceps a little bit later. But well, actually, I'll quickly give you an idea. So this is not a Cordyceps sinensis. So Cordyceps sinensis is what the TCM research is all about and stuff like that. But I'm a wild hunter, right? And this is a very long example. And also sinensis are probably like that big, right? If you were out hunting sinensis on the Tibetan plains, you would be super lucky. Like it would be like a gangbuster day if you pulled 50 out of the ground. Do you know what I mean? That would be a hard day's work. Whereas if you find a really good patch of the right trees, right, you can easily you can pull that in an hour of the gunny eye. So this is actually a native cordyceps of Australia, which has very, very similar, if not identical, properties to the Cordyceps sinensis. But you can see it's basically like an insect. So one of the problems with the cordyceps industry is that where it comes from in like Tibet and Bhutan and all that sort of thing, and obviously Tibet is like, now part of China and all that sort of thing, is that unless you're buying it in the field, there's a whole bunch of hands that go into like, buying their middlemen, et cetera, and it's worth more per ounce than gold. So even if you had the money, I would not go and buy Cordyceps sinensis. And I've been tempted to do this, just to be clear, right? Like from a reputable Chinese supplier here in Australia, even if you're like, yeah, I got the money, I want to try it out. I'm sure it would be amazing if you could get, legitimate Cordyceps sinensis, but there are adulterants. They put bits of metal in them, like to make them a little bit more weighty. If you imagine something that's literally worth gold, it's worth their time and energy to do that. So I have got this fantasy one day of going to Bhutan and literally going and buying cordyceps and somehow sneaking over the border without getting murdered, because that's the other thing when you're dealing with, and sorry if that sounded a bit dark, but like when you're dealing with some of these herbs, ginseng is another one. Like Ron Teagarden, who's like the granddaddy of tonic herbalism and adaptogenic Chinese herbs in terms of bringing it to the West, he talks about how he had I think it was like 100-year-old ginseng, and he literally hid it in a like a baby food bottle, because if he was found with it and someone knew what they were looking for, they would have killed him for it, which is a real shame. But like this is kind of the value of some of these tonic herbs. And it's kind of an irony actually, because these things are supposed to develop a greater spirit. They're supposed to develop a greater sense of well-being. But, for those who, and we see this a lot in the health industry, like I'm not going to name names, but turmeric is a really good example where everyone just jumped on and said, yeah, my turmeric's the best and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, if you do the research, it's actually based on the curcumin levels and it's really an extract of the curcumin, but people saw it as a fad and they jumped on. And one of the things that I like to do, because, I don't want to give anything out that I'm not willing to take myself, is I'm going to try and source the best. That's otherwise, what's the point? There's plenty of other things that are more lucrative in this world. So why would you, especially if you're trying to help people, do anything less than your best? But yeah, I said sinensis does not really have that. So, sorry, I realized I've got so far off track. Why was I talking about cordyceps? Oh yeah, because the cordyceps is worth so much like that. What they worked out is that they couldn't grow the fruiting bodies. They can grow the fruiting bodies of militaris, which is another slightly different variety, which we also work with. So we do actually have fruiting bodies of that. But with the sinensis, that's actually grown in like a vegetable broth. So it's like a myceliated form. But unlike the fruiting bodies that are grown on that caked grain agent that I'm talking about, you can separate the vegetable broth because it's not something that melds with the mycelium in the same way, so that the mycelium you're actually getting from the sinensis is nutraceutically bioactive, right, and is what you're getting. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it makes sense. And I like it about the McDonald's as well earlier, because, it's just if they're not being grown from something with substance and something that, like wood or bark, then, it's like it's just been cultivated in a lab, and you're missing all of those long chains that you were talking about, which seems that's the good stuff, right?
Absolutely, man. And I mean, another example of that, like, even though, I mean, as I was saying, like, my first love was Sharga. Sharga is one of those ones where if you grow it in a lab, there's certain X factors that just aren't present. And one of the cool things about Sharga is that the closer it grows to the northern lights, right, which is like this penumbra, right, that sort of like circulates around the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, it actually increases a lot of the properties in it, including this kind of X factor. So things like its anti-radiation properties, right, actually increase the closer it is to that. So this is another really cool thing, actually, because if you're going to get your Sharga, this is getting into proper geek level stuff. You're actually looking for stuff that's, at this, I looked at this a while ago, so I'm not 100% sure if this is the number. So if it's wrong, I will let you know. Right, but 64 degrees latitude, right, is what you're looking for, right? And if it's below that, and there is definitely plenty of Sharga out there that's like not grown in that, it's just not as good. Because one thing we've got to remember when we're looking at herbs and stuff like that is we look at like these scientific studies or whatever, but and I get it because I've been there too, where you go, oh, well, okay, if that means that and that equals that, then that must mean that across the board. And that's not how it works. If you've ever grown plants in your garden, like a bug might eat one of them and the other one doesn't, right? It actually goes back to like Mendel's like original understanding of, genetics and the change, and it goes into Darwinism and evolution and stuff like that. Some things are just stronger than others and they're going to survive stronger. So when the environment's there, which also drops into D-Dow, which means basically the herbs are coming from their original source. When things come from their original source, then they have a different kind of frequency that translates beyond just the energetic, which I love to talk about, obviously, but into the actual physicality when you look at these things from a biochemistry breakdown. So there's something to be said for that. Do you know what I mean? Right? This is why it's ironic, like, in Australia, like a lot of people don't know this in the world, but macadamias are actually from Australia. That's where they're from. But the predominant growing of macadamias actually happens in Hawaii, right, and Fiji and places like that. But the macadamias that are grown in their region are going to have a certain frequency that they're just not going to have in places like Hawaii. And particularly when you're dealing with these adaptogenic plants that have so many things going on for them, right, this sort of whole energy and emphasis on the D-Dow is amplified significantly. So
you talk more about what the D-Dow is.
Yeah, well, okay. So as I said before, the D-Dow means that, like, for example, our reishi comes from Chiang Mai, which I was fortunate enough, me and Dan, we visited there in 2019, and we went to this place called Heavenly Lake. And I like to say to people, I've seen North Korea, because I literally have. Didn't see anything much than the other side of a lake, but it's funny. That was hectically controlled. There was like literally military forces and stuff up there when we went there. But it is an area that is like beautiful and pristine. And I mean, the goji berries that we bought from like some street vendor, I wish I could bring them in. They remind me of like Ron Teagarden's like Heavenly Mountain goji berries. They were like soft and juicy and sweet, and that I definitely did not bring any home because that would be illegal. So just saying. All right, but I mean, like everything that was grown there was just phenomenal, and the love of mushrooms, particularly things like the sacred tonic herbs like reishi and ginseng, was just so obvious. They would literally have parklands where they'd have iconography to reishi and ginseng. you're not allowed to in the entire Chiangbai area use any form of pesticides and things like that. But it's a DAO area for tonic herbs. So a lot of the tonic herbs come out of there. We saw like wild eleuthero growing there. We did find some reishi, and while we were traveling around, like we had a reishi that obviously we can take back with us, but we trekked around with it for a while, and then we finally gave it up to this garden and all that sort of thing. And it was just awesome to have these herbs around us. But yeah, DAO basically means that it comes from that original area. And so if you think about like the soils and the environmental conditions and the things that something was birthed at, it's very, very difficult to mimic that in a way. Like, actually, you know what? Bananas is actually another really good example. A lot of people don't know that bananas are a herb, right? They are a fruit, but they're a herb. And the bananas that we eat don't have any seeds in them. So they're actually sterile in that sense. But if you get original bananas, they look vastly different to the bananas that we have. And this is not taking away from the potassium and all the good things that are in bananas that we have. But as I'm sure you can imagine, if you get hold of like real bananas, it's a totally different experience. And so these come from like a completely different region of the world, even though like in Australia where we've got similar conditions, we can grow those bananas here and mimic to some degree their original environment. Now, I know I'm sort of cross-pollinating between the hybridizing of a plant as well as where it comes from, but I'm just trying to illustrate that like the closest you can get to that original source is the closest you're going to get to having at its maximum potency. The other thing about DAO, because DAO is talked about a lot in tonic herbal circles, for those who are in the know, DAO's not like something that's like rare. It's actually a benchmark. Like if you don't have DAO herbs, then you shouldn't even be in the business of herbs. So it's not like this badge of, it is a badge of honor but it's kind of like it's like a white belt, right? Of tonic herbs. It really is. If you haven't got the white belt, you don't deserve a black, yellow, green, red, whatever belt. Do you know what I mean? So DAO is like a beginning point.
And
you know what? We actually have a blog on DAO. So if you jump on our website, like we've actually got heaps of blogs about stuff, but if you want to learn more about DAO that doesn't have silly analogies, right, then we have a blog about that also.
Beautiful. We can point people there a little bit later. Let's talk more about adaptogens then. How many adaptogens or do you guys stock and do you guys mainly use, and also yourself? Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, first of all, like I didn't actually think you were going to ask that. I thought you were going to ask a slightly different question. So I'm going to go with how my mind interpreted it. So I thought you were actually going to ask how many adaptogens there are in the world, because this is another really important thing, is that adaptogens are quite rare. Like when you think about like the amount of plants and species of plants that are in the world, there are probably, and there's some contention around this because adaptogen is a term that really only came out in the 1970s. It was sort of coined by a couple of Russians who were looking for something that was very similar to Panat's ginseng, which is like the Korean ginseng and the Chinese ginseng, which is a very proper, young, heating herb, which they found made like incredibly durable soldiers, because when they were fighting the Koreans, they just kept getting beaten off and beaten off and beaten off. And in the end, because they were outnumbered, it was definitely a Sparta type situation. The Koreans were going down, but they found that they had storehouses of this ginseng. So they took it back and they got the scientists to look at this. So adaptogen is a relatively new term that was only coined because they were trying to find something that was similar to this. So there's probably no more than maybe 150, maximum like 200 adaptogens in the world. And I think that that's really stretching it. And there's different classes, right, of those adaptogens. But in terms of what adaptogens I take, I tend to take reishi every day, and there's a whole another thing with that. Like reishi is a Shen herb. It's a herb of spirit, right? But it also is what's known as a 3 treasure tonic, which means it nourishes Jing, Qi, and Shen. I think we'll talk about like the 3 treasures a little bit later on. I take cordyceps every day because in herbal circles, it's known that if you want to actually refurbish your original essence, then you need to take that like for a significant period of time, like upwards of 20 years. So it's kind of like the other thing about adaptogens is that when you look at their cultural history, they tend to have these deep associations with longevity. Like ashwagandha, for example, it's known as it's either a rishi or a Rapunisha herb, right? Which basically means it's like one of the top 3 herbs in Ayurveda. And it's because it increases life expectancy. And this is one of the things the adaptogens do. You bring your body into harmony and it's going to increase life expectancy. I also take Sharga. I take lion's mane, which is arguably an adaptogen.
When you say arguably, what do you mean by that? Like, is there some sort of...
I mean, it definitely aids in adaptability of the brain and things like that. There's contention around this. Like, you've got to understand that the ones that are locked in as adaptogens, these are the ones that like people decided to go out and do their research on and say this is an adaptogen kind of thing. So some of these other ones are, because we've got to be very careful. We live in an internet world now where you can Wikipedia anything, right? So, you've got to have due diligence and things like that. So I'm just kind of, maybe I'll just list off all the herbs I take. Lots, man. But look, I tend to take the mushrooms like a lot because they are kind of like the first step to adaptogens. Like medicinal mushrooms are adaptogens. So I'm excited to have something that's going to consistently increase the viability of my immune system and whatever other little nuanced functions that need to happen, including my brain. As I said, I'm really interested in sports and stamina at the moment. So I'm really excited about ashwagandha and getting like phenomenal results from that. I take ant. Which is like another adaptogen, which also comes from Chengbai, which is another D-Dao source. I take pearl, right? Like pearl has like a whole long history of use as well. And it's funny because like you think of pearl, it's really sold as a beauty tonic. It's so much more than that. Like it increases IQ. It's a Jing tonic. It's an incredible Shen tonic. Like it's one of the most stabilizing Shen tonic. Shen, by the way, is spirit.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? You mentioned Shen.
Yeah, I think maybe now we should jump into the 3 treasures. What do you think about that? Okay, so the coolest way to explain the 3 treasures, right, is to use a candle. Right, it's not my analogy, right, but I did bring a candle. So I brought 2 candles actually. It's funny how actually like I like to bring up like Blade Runner as a reference. Like I don't know if you remember when Rutger Hauer's character, rest in peace, Rutger Hauer, right, talks about basically when he's like asking for more life, his master says that a candle that burns twice as bright burns half as long. So there's certain things, certain idioms that are in our language that we tend to latch onto, even if it's unconsciously, and there's a reason for that. We associate like each time we move around the sun, a birthday by lighting a candle. So there's something about our life force that's delineated by a candle. And I think it also goes back to times when we literally crouched around fires as our only source of like heat and protection against enemies. And so there's something very iconic about that. But anyway, so Jing, Qi, and Shen, right? I'm sure you guys have all heard of Qi because we heard of things like Qigong and Tai Chi, and Qi has become like this, which is not to be like confused with Chia, by the way, right? Qi or Ki in the Japanese is really referring to like the animation of of like the original essence or jing, and shen, right, is what we're ultimately trying to express. Let's break it down and make it really simple. So if you imagine you've got a candle, and I've got this brilliant candle in front of me here, that's one I prepared earlier. And so the jing, right, which is what's kind of like given to you at birth, it's like your battery, right, or your luck bucket. And once you've poured out your luck bucket, it's kind of game over. And I can go and make that a bit more sciencey so that it doesn't just sound like an analogy, right? It's very much related to the chromosomes and the telomeres on your chromosomes. So your telomeres are like these little, they kind of look like little rabbit ears. And every time they have like a certain level of revolutions, right? And once you've used up all those revolutions and your telomeres have shortened, it's game over. Anything that's sitting in your system, whether it's cancers, microbes, pathogenic cells, all that sort of thing starts to unravel your DNA and like quickly kind of remove you from the picture, as it were. And this is why tonic herbalism is all about focusing on the jing, which is the foundational essence, right? And it's almost like the bedrock on which everything else builds. But the best way, again, to understand it, right, is if you imagine that the jing is the candle, right? So you've got like the wax of your candle and you've got the wick of your candle. And I've got two candles here. Why have I got two candles? Well, that's a good question. Again, Blade Runner, right? Just as many times as I can reference that. So when this candle's like, which one of these do you think, Alex, is going to burn the longest?
The thick one.
The thick one. That is correct. You looked at my notes. So yeah, and the reason for that is it's like much thicker, right? Whereas this one is just like thin. So if we can imagine that what we're given through, and this is why it's important, guys, to look after your health, because when you have kids, it's that combination between, you know, the partner's health points, if you were, right, that combine to make that baby. So you want that to be as like potent as possible, because you're not just eating and looking after yourself for your generation and yourself. You're doing it for the next generation that you pass on, because otherwise we end up having a weakening of generations over time, which, you know, you can see from like the Potenza cat experiment, where the cats got weaker and weaker, right, because there's shorter generations so they could see it. And ultimately, like they became so weak they couldn't even reproduce. So the jing is basically the fat of the candle. And it's interesting that jing foods tend to be fat-based too. So it's just almost like this doctrine of signatures, like where you know, you can just see it from that perspective. And the length of this wick, right, is also going to determine it. So even though this is longer, right, if we squash this down, we're going to have a much shorter candle. So you're absolutely right. This is definitely going to be the stronger one. So when I light this, which I definitely do not bring a lighter for, so just imagine that I light this, that's then the flame, right, that happens at birth. So the moment that, well, actually it's the moment conception happens. The moment conception happens, you start to burn this jing down. And obviously when you're in the womb, you're going through incredible, like, you know, polymorphic changes, going from a single cell to 2 cells to 4 cells, and just, you know, consistently changing and growing and growing and growing. So you actually use, frighteningly enough, about a third of all of your telomeres that you're ever going to have just to get out of your mother's womb. So that's a little scary. But wait, it gets worse, right? You then spend, right, the first 20 years of your life, right, using another third, because obviously we know when we go through that period of like puberty, and like that's another time of incredible change, right, where you grow quicker and you've got all these hormonal changes, etc. So you use another third, and then, right, you've got 1/3 of that left to spend. So not really a lot. So, all right, sit with that depressing thought. So anyway, the idea is that you light this, and the moment you light it, it's kind of like, think of like an Acme cartoon. You're lighting a stick of dynamite, and you better get that thing out of your hand or it's going to blow up. So that light is immediately burning that jing. And chi is sort of found in respiration, right? And when we look at things like what yogis talk about, which is that we've only got a certain amount of heartbeats but more importantly, breaths, there's all this stuff to do with the breath. So when we understand that the breath is related to chi, this makes a lot of sense, right? It's also related to digestion. So it's that fire of digestion and that ignition of the respiratory system as well. But then what happens, like, let's say we're in the dark, right, and we've lit this candle. What's the ultimate expression of that candle?
Light.
Exactly, right? So when we understand that, and this sort of helps deal with that depressing thought, right? When we understand that we've spent all of this energy getting out of the womb and then basically getting to like at least, a baseline level of adulthood, and then we've only got a third of our money left, we're going to feel a little bit frustrated by that. But when you understand that it's not actually about your jing, that the longer you can contain your jing, the longer you can contain your shen and cultivate your shen. So your shen is that spirit energy that basically emanates from the candle. Now when we go back to the reishi, we've got a shiny mushroom. So that shiny mushroom, that lucidum, is very much reflective of that shen. But as I was saying earlier, this is actually what's called a 3-treasure tonic. So jing, qi, and shen are all part of this 3-treasure system. And when you tend to cultivate strong jing, which most of us have when we're younger, right, we'll then burn it, right, through our qi, right? But you get strong qi from strong jing, basically. But you're immediately beginning to die, essentially, the moment you're conceived. That's sort of the whole idea of lighting a candle. But what you take with you is your spiritual lessons, right? Like for those of you guys who believe in more than just this lifetime, right? Or even if you just believe that you go to heaven or whatever, like think of it as your brownie points. You don't want to rock up to the pearly gates and Peter goes, no. Sorry, mate.
You didn't let.
Not enough shen points. Like, I'd like to help you, man, but my hands are tied, right? So, what we take with us, like from this life, is that the caring and the sharing and the softening of the heart. And especially in this day and age where there's just so much information coming at us, there's so many news channels telling us this and that and the other thing. The stress levels at the moment are just out of control. And one of the things that like stress does is it basically destroys the shen. And there's nothing more important than shen. And also when you destroy the shen, you tend to destroy the jing, because you have to. It's almost like the same way that your body is constantly alkalizing by leaching like minerals from your bones when you do the wrong thing and making them more and more brittle over time. The same thing's kind of happening to your jing, right? If you're stressed, you're burning yourself out. And that's not to suggest you should have a sedentary lifestyle. That's not a good idea either, because then you're just going to do nothing with your life. What you want to do is be moderately active. We were discussing before Dave Goggins, doing Dave Goggins, that's, for very, very few people. And if you look into like some of the things that, has happened for him, like he's now having complications, as a result of what he chooses to do. So we're always looking for balance and harmony, a little bit of exercise, a little bit of rest, all right? Not too much of one or the other, because then you're too light or too dark.
To get to rest in our life, and even I often say to people, like, rest isn't staring at a screen. The rest is like, it's true.
It is if you're a computer.
To truly rest, like sit and close your eyes and just be with yourself. That's resting. Being on your phone isn't resting. Like, hey, it's more resting than running, 21 kilometers. But it's still not complete rest. I learned that lesson when we were fasting last year. Like, complete rest is doing nothing with your eyes closed, and we've forgotten how to do that. We're not taught to rest, The last 5 days I've been surfing every day, and today I'm like, Alex, don't surf, don't do anything, rest. like you have to do that just as much, it's just as important. Anyway, I'm on my soapbox there. I have a question for you. Is there a way to rebuild your Jing? Can you, because I've read a couple of books on telomeres and through fasting. I know there's a lot of benefits to cell health, and you can sort of repair your length of telomeres. So can you, in theory, build your Jing back up?
Yeah, you can, absolutely. To break that down, hopefully I've explained the three treasures adequately enough. So you've got essentially what's called prenatal Jing and postnatal Jing. So the prenatal Jing is what you're given, right, by your parents. The postnatal Jing, and so that's like, imagine that is like your energy reserves, and you want to avoid tapping that energy reserve as much as possible. Eventually, you're going to tap it. But if you can look after yourself, you can be like working with your postnatal Jing, which is something that you can actually refurbish. Now, postnatal Jing is a lot easier to refurbish than prenatal Jing. Like traditional Chinese medicine suggests that you cannot refurbish prenatal Jing. Taoist tonic herbalism is different. It says that you can, and that's why I was saying before that from a prenatal Jing perspective, cordyceps is one of those ones where if you take a good quality cordyceps religiously every day for 20, this is like secret herbal stuff, like they don't talk about this, right? For 20 years, right, you can actually start to rebuild your prenatal Jing. But we've got to look at this from a mathematics perspective, so we're rational about it. Just because you're rebuilding your prenatal Jing over 20 years, you're also probably ultimately going to spend more of that prenatal Jing. So you're not actually going to rebuild that unless you're like, as you were saying before, like in a completely rested state where you're unruffled by society and you'll be on another level. And like, that's not really a modern likelihood. However, what we're seeing at the moment, and I think this is because what you were saying about not getting enough rest and things like that, but also just the fact that everyone's so busy and so overwhelmed and so stressed out, right, that they're becoming worn down. And we've got like electromagnetic fields messing with us. Like turn your Wi-Fi off at night, guys. It's not hard. Like I'm guilty of not doing that for ages. And then I seriously went, I live in a mud brick house. It's hard enough for me to get Wi-Fi in certain parts of my house. Why don't I just switch it off at night? Do you know what I mean? Like that way you're going to rest down. Don't have your phone in your room. Don't have a digital alarm clock or any of those sort of things. These things take your Jing away. Like before we actually look at how to rebuild your Jing, I think it's important to look at like the things that are robbing people's Jing because, to get a bit Dave Goggins on this, you've got to like look in that, the mirror of, what does he call it? The mirror of accountability, right? You've got to look there and you've got to like look honestly what you're doing, because another big problem is that people want an instant fix, but they're not willing to actually change themselves. And obviously, look, I'm not having a judgment, like everyone's sort of at whatever level they're playing at, but you've got to be honest with where you're at. If you're not honest with where you're at, you're not going to be able to change where you're at. So just little simple things like turning off your Wi-Fi, not having any electronic devices, like try not to watch TV too much, try not to like play with any of your electronic devices, particularly blue screen devices like computers, cell phones, iPads, TVs, all that sort of thing, an hour before bed, because that whole blue screen is actually telling your brain, right, it's the middle of summer, don't go to sleep. Now, by the way, there is certain technologies that you can actually get to put over those screens. I've actually got one on my TV, which is like, it like blocks out blue light. It's pretty cool. But it doesn't matter. It's still the stimulation factor as well. Rest down, meditate, do some yoga, read a book, whatever. Doing those sort of things and getting into that calm state is really important. The other thing is for those who like to party, right, and this is sort of like a double-edged sword where when you're young, you have so much Jing, or in a lot of cases, you have so much Jing, you don't think you're going to break. right? You don't think you're going to die. Right? In fact, there's actually an unconscious thing in children where they don't actually know until a certain age that they're going to die. That's why they do really stupid things. And so when you understand that going out and partying too much wears you down, destroys your jing, you've got to decide on what balance level you're going to play that. I was actually chatting to some 20-somethings who I think they're getting into their like mid or late 20s relatively recently, and they were sort of confessing to me. They go, yeah, because like we kind of met up in like I think 2015. I hadn't seen most of them since then until like literally this year, or it might have been last year, late last year. And they were just like, yeah, Jules, I'm not quite as where I was. I'm starting to get what you were saying about this jing thing. And this is in your 20s. But the funny thing is you can have this strength and jing at any age, so you can rebuild it. But again, it's going to depend on where you're at and what's going on in your body. But the first thing is you've got to like be honest about what you're doing. Take stressful relationships out of your life. If you're in stressful relationships that don't work on that stuff. If you're carrying around a whole bunch of garbage from your childhood, go get some therapy or, whatever it is that you feel you need to work through that, because all of those things are robbing you of your jing. So even if you're taking these things that can rebuild your jing, they're only going to do so much, and these are the tough things you got to look at. Again, you got to be accountable to yourself. But anyway, what can you do to rebuild your jing? Okay. I think let's start with free stuff, right? So the first thing you can do is you can go for a walk, right? Preferably out in the sun. You're getting some perambulation. You're actually like working your body in a way that's very, very gentle, right? But you're allowing your body to start basically pump lymphatic system, like stuff around your lymphatic system, which doesn't work with a heart in the same way that our circulatory system works. And you're starting to detoxify and rebuild your body that way. Being in the sun, we've been taught so many things about how bad it is. The sun is, you wouldn't be here on this planet if it wasn't for the sun. I think it's with 24 hours without the sun, you'd pretty much be dead. So there's a reason why sun worship was such a big thing in the past, because they realized that the sun was almost like this god that came across the sky and gave life. So get out into the sun. Research some stuff about vitamin D and how much, if your vitamin D isn't present in your body, it has a whole host of issues, right? Whereas when it is, right, it has a whole host of things that are really good for you and beneficial for you, including jing. So that's like the first thing, really. If you're lucky enough, like I am, I live in Warburton, so I'm near one of the best springs in the world. So I'm super lucky. And so I drink really high quality water, flushing your system out. These are the sort of things that can actually prepare your body. There's an old ninja proverb which says clean first and build second, right? Like so many people want to immediately build without clearing out the garbage, right? Like what you were talking about, fasting and resting. If you feel the need to, and even if you want to do lazy stuff, like go and get a colonic, go get your guts cleaned out so it can work more functionally and take nutrients in more. You'll need less and you'll feel happy and you'll be more balanced. Your microbiome will be more balanced. There's all these things that can happen as a result of that. It's a tricky one depending on what your diet is. I have to say that I do know that jing foods are not fruit or things like that. They do tend to be more on the fat-based side of things, which, that does lend to, for some people, the need to eat meat and things like that. But even if you decide that you want to be as extreme as a raw vegan, right, make sure you're getting good quality fats. There's some great ones out there like hemp seeds, which contain adestin, one of the most digestible forms of protein. And in and of itself, it's a phenomenal superfood. Chia seeds, which also balance your omega-3 levels, lowering inflammation. And when we think about lowering inflammation, understand how that relates to basically the jing being related to a body in balance, right? So if it's out of balance and you've got inflammation, So all these little things, but fats are a Jing food, right? There's a word in Ayurveda which is ojas, right? And ojas foods, right, also mean Jing. When we look for foods that are black, by the way, those are also Jing. So shilajit, right, which is a Jing food in the Ayurvedic system, which is like this fulvic acid rich kind of like paste that's prepared using certain herbs, and it's like this, it looks like this black sticky glue, like super viscous, and you dissolve that in water. But it's known to be one of those, again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing, rapashani or rishini herbs, right, which is like a longevity herb. It extends life, and Jing things do that. When we look up at the night sky, right, if we don't live in a city environment, we actually see blackness. So that's kind of that as above, so below, as within, so without reflection of what Jing is. Jing is black. So get black chia seeds, get, black rice instead of white rice. The more you can incorporate black foods into your diet, the more you're going to get, basic Jing stuff into you. And then we get more into the Jing herbs themselves. So the more you can actually start incorporating Jing herbs like cordyceps. Cordyceps is Qi and Jing, and that's why it's used by athletes, because it rebuilds like the kidneys. I should have also said, by the way, that the Jing resides in the kidneys, the reproductive system, and the bones of the body. Which, when we do a little bit of anatomy and physiology, like we understand how significant the bones are. Like it takes 7 years for the bone marrow to replace itself, whereas it takes like 24 hours for the blood to replace itself. So it's Jing, right? Things that are like deep within, that's what Jing actually is. Your reproductive system is pretty much how we continue ourselves on Earth. So obviously that's going to be related to the Jing. This whole thing that we're seeing where people's reproductive systems are getting out of balance, libidos are going down, and it's important to understand actually the meaning of the word libido. It's not about how much sex you can have, because too much sex, especially for men, actually leaks your Jing. In Taoism, they consider like a single drop of semen to be equivocate to 1,000 drops of blood. So libido means life force. So if we feel libido, it means we feel alive, whether that life force is centered in our reproductive system, right, and therefore like we feel like sexually active or whatever, or we basically re-nourish our bones, our tissues, our muscles and things like that. So think of it as a reservoir of power. And our kidneys is kind of the primary organ of Jing, right? And for those who do Qigong, they know that like you tap your kidneys, right? Tapping your kidneys is actually a way of also building your Jing, all right? And it's a practice to do that. And you've got to be really gentle about that, so don't just whack your kidneys, because your kidneys are precious. But that is literally where your bank vault of prenatal Jing resides, is in your kidneys. So they're very significant from that perspective. So we're looking for herbs that nourish Jing, and cordyceps nourishes like kidney yin and kidney yang, right? It's like a really good Qi herb. Reishi, as I said, is a 3 treasure tonic. It is primarily Shen, but it's also like, it's funny, like years ago I got this, and I didn't know this about Reishi. I got this email and this person was like, yeah, man, like ever since I've been taking your Reishi, I've been smashing her on the basketball court. I'm owning it. And I'm like, wait, what? Like that's not what Reishi's supposed to do. But for some people, it activates the Qi. It activates it through the lungs. It gives you much greater sports performance. And that's great. If that's what it does for you and that's what you need, that's fantastic. All right. I remember when I gave Reishi to my son, like he noticed that he had an increased energy, and he was quite young at the time. So therefore, that's not surprising. But for most of us, we're stressed. And the thing with adaptogens is they're going to go where the body needs it most. So it just can calm you down, right? And again, like what we're saying, when we go into that rest state, when we go into that calm state, we're rebuilding our Jing. So that's why Reishi is so phenomenal in the fact that it works on that. And it's no surprise then it's worked through the liver, right? Also, and the kidneys also basically leads to like separate Jing elements. So it's kind of like got different elements to that three treasure that's bringing in the Jing. Another really cool one, I haven't brought this out yet. So look, this is not a good example of Sharga. I'm really going to get another one. Seriously, it looks like a weird mustache or like something else, right? This is not what Sharga normally looks like, but this is a Sharga mushroom, Inonotus obliquus, and the inside of it is like this kind of like orangey, tanny, corky layer, and on the outside, what color do we have? Black, right? And what color do we have, just quickly, on the cordyceps head? Black, right? That's why in some ways I think from a Jing perspective, I know that Militaris has different qualities as a cordyceps, but I feel that the Sinensis and Gunnii, right, is it's more significantly Jing. You know, yellow is and oranges tend to be more about Qi because all that solar plexus energy and second chakra energy. But so Sharga is another really good way to build up Jing. Sharga also contains, like, I think it's one of the highest forms of superoxide dismutase of any food on the planet. Now, superoxide dismutase is like the internal antioxidant system, right, in your body. So it's not that it just magically puts it into you, it's that it activates your body to produce that superoxide dismutase, and it does it in a really significant way. And it's also the most alkaline food source, right, of anything on the planet. I think that also alkalizing your body when it's appropriate, right, not to the extreme, because, I mean, again, like everyone thinks of acid as being a bad thing. It's only a bad thing because we have an acid diet, right, and we have an acid lifestyle, and we have acid ways of thinking, and we have like an acid planet, really, because our planet is so toxic. But if we were the opposite, right, like you imagine like in a completely different age where everyone's just like sitting around doing nothing, we probably need a little bit of that acid. You know, if you've ever had anything that's too alkaline, it's equally toxic to the body as something that's acid. But anyway, in this day and age, this is one of the most alkaline foods on the planet based on its mineral ratios of rubidium, cesium, and I think it's potassium. And the cesium actually, just as a fun fact, right? Like if it's known as a coal extender. So if I light this, right, and I get it properly lit, in theory at least, it won't go out. So this is actually one of the ways we used to transport fire. Not that this was the chosen tinder fungus. There's a lot of misinformation about that's like perpetuated about, let's see, the Iceman, that Sharga was on it. It wasn't Sharga. It was actually a birch polypore, and I think it was Amadou, which is a tinder fungus. So if you can imagine, you would hollow out a mushroom like this and poke like an ash from your fire, and like kind of, you could almost put a little kind of corky thing in it and you could carry it for long distances. And imagine during ice ages where this is your lifeblood, like you can literally carry it with that. But anyway, so this is definitely a really profound Jing substance. And what's great about it is it's got no lethal dose limit. So you can actually take very large amounts of them. Like I've experimented with taking like, you know, super large doses, and some other like people in the mushroom field have taken super large doses, you know, just to experiment, because it's just building and nourishing so many minerals and so many complexes into your system, and it's safe to do so when you do it with these things. That's another thing about adaptogens, and particularly tonic herbs, is that like the worst kind of negative effect that you can get from them is you might get a little bit of a stomach cramp, or you might get diarrhea or something. And that just means you need to adjust the dose. But unlike an inferior herb, they do not have that toxic effect. And just quickly talking about the, it's the Shenong Benchao Jing, right, which was like the Materia Medica. The guy who sort of wrote that book was kind of like poisoning and healing himself. He didn't live long. I think he ended up like his skin went green or something like that. But he would literally take these certain herbs, because we just think as well in especially modern herbalism that's like, oh, anything's all good, just take it all. Like even things like echinacea. Echinacea is not a tonic herb, which means that if you take too much of it, it'll actually have a negative effect. It's not on the extreme end of the scale, so you could just keep smashing that, right? But its effect is going to be reduced significantly, and it will start having negative effects. But there are certain herbs which you should not prescribe or utilize or touch, right, unless you know what you're doing. And so these are known as the inferior herbs. So you've got the inferior herbs up here, you've got the supporting herbs here, and then you've got the tonic herbs down here. And the tonic herbs can be taken every day. You can definitely take large amounts of reishi, right, for a period of time. They have very, very little or no negative effects. And that's what we're looking for. That's the cleverness of the adaptogens, is that they just allow your body to work with whatever they need to be worked with. So,
we've talked.
What's that?
We've talked about building yin. How do we cultivate shen?
Yeah. Okay. Well, for a start, turn your TV off. Right. The more you can disconnect and go into nature, right? Again, being in the sun, as much as that builds your jing, it also builds your shen, because what is the sun if not a light source, right? And I don't know if you guys know this, but like your pineal, which is like a gland here, or a chakra, whatever, right? It actually has what's called photoretinic cells. And so that means that it's designed to actually take light in. It like your eyes, which also have photoretinic cells, right? It's designed to actually take light in. So it feeds the pineal by being in these environments. And I mean, we all know this. Even people who don't believe in any of this stuff, they know that even if they're going to go, because I live in a tourist town and we just got invaded, and there are people down the river and at the caravan park, and they're blasting their music and they're drinking alcohol and they're partying and all that sort of thing. Even though they're doing that kind of level of activity, just being around the trees, just having like the odd bird noise come in, or like clean air or sunshine, or, going and sitting in like a rubber tube in the river or whatever it is they do, they're replenishing themselves by these elemental things that they just rebuild you. And they just cultivate your shen. We all know that when we have like a close encounter in nature, I had one the other day actually, like it's funny, like when you're in a more calm state, birds aren't as scared of you. I had this little bird sort of like twitter up to me and all that sort of thing. And actually I have spiders in my shower, and I've been thinking about this for the last week. I'm like, all right, I get it. I can go, oh, isn't that a cute little kitty cat or a cute bird or whatever, but like what about spiders? For some reason I'm looking at these like they're baby spiders, so they're not even adults, and I'm like, oh, they're so cute, look at the little baby spiders. And so I'm like, what's happening to me, man? I used to be scared of spiders. This is bizarre. But so the more you interact with nature and start to understand it on a different level, again, I would still choose a cute baby bird over a cute baby spider, but you start to have more of these close encounters, and I think that they reflect energetically into your spirit. So really that's the first thing. Also, when you clean yourself out, right, you make this whole kind of your guts and your organ systems work in a way that's going to harmonize different things better. The other thing as well, like going back to, childhood stuff, when you clear out your childhood trauma, you feel lighter. You're looking for things that make you feel lighter. The more you can do that, the more shen you have. And that actually, when you get into the herbs and start incorporating that, that's what's going to make them work even more effectively. But it is a bit of a chicken and the egg thing. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, on the one hand, you could take these herbs, which lead you to, go out into nature or get therapy or eat better and blah, 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 blah. So whatever works. It's whatever gets you to drink the water, all right? As long as water and not Kool-Aid.
That's about tonic herbs for shen.
Yeah, so probably my favorite one is reishi, really, hands down, because it's of what it does, being a white rod fungus, being that whole idea of shiny mushroom, given that its name, it's got various names like mushroom of fortune and things like that. It's got something of a great spirit nature to you. And it can, for some people, be like an amazing and sort of instant fix, right? For others, it actually puts you through your spiritual paces. It really just does depend. But either way, it's going to lead you home back into the heart, back into like being, more and more calm, more and more centered and grounded and things like that. So, and because it's also got all these immune benefits and other benefits besides, I think it's a really good thing to incorporate for that reason. The second one, I would say, is Pearl, right? Pearl is phenomenal. Like for people who have difficulty sleeping, I remember I went and did this. I haven't been to a festival in a long time. My friends were like, come on, man, they were selling pine cones. Like, come on, man, let's like come up to this festival. And I was like, oh, I don't know. So I went up to this festival and I remember I took Pearl, and even though I was like, I must have been sleeping within 100 meters of the dance floor or whatever, I could still rest down and sleep enough. So it's got this very calm, and it's white. The other thing is, like, I think with Shen stuff, like when we think of our crown chakra, we think of white. When we see like, someone in white, we think, oh, they're holier than thou. We think of white light. White light contains all other light spectrums. A rainbow is contained within white light. So there's this whole thing with white. But Pearl's also got things that are very, very similar to the human body. It's got this protein called nacra, which calms you down. And also is very similar to your bones. Again, bone marrow and bones, very significant to like building your jing. So the other thing about the three treasures, we've almost got to look at it not as a line going jing, qi, shen, but really more of a circle, like an Ouroboros. If you guys are familiar with like that symbol where you see a snake that eats itself, there's a reason why that's used. It's talking about the eternity of it all. And probably the Taoist masters actually figured out how to link Shen up back with Jing. So by cultivating enough Shen, they could then feed that back into the Jing. And we can do that to some degree, but I suppose in theory there's a way to do that permanently, because we do know from a scientific level that you can take a human cell, put it in a petri dish, in an agar dish, and it can live forever. Right? So in theory, it's actually possible from a scientific level. In practice, that's not what we really see. So let's not, kind of go too far out of that. But I think because Pearl has this ability for even the most stressed people to just calm their state of anxiety down, I think that's really important. So that's the second one. Now, the third one's like, it's interesting because I think a lot of people don't take this herb for that reason, but I had an experience over in China that I'll quickly share because I had this love with reishi, and this is why I think I've had to go through these different tests with all the mushrooms, and this was the last one. I kind of done Sharga. I gone through a massive process with cordyceps. I've had this like love affair with reishi, and I was like, why is everyone into lion's mane, man? I don't get it. It's just because of Joe Rogan and blah, 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 and all that sort of thing. They just want to put it in their coffee. Well, weirdly enough, when I was the lion's mane farm, and I'm literally surrounded by like millions and millions of lion's mane, I could feel my frontal lobe pulsing, and I could feel it sort of doing something that wasn't just about neural activation from the perspective of cognitive function. I could feel its Shen quality. Now, what color is lion's mane? It's white. What does it look like? It looks like this brain with all these tendrils. And even though not to associate the Western mindset of the brain, which is very much the physical brain and the obsession with the brain, we can look at it from the perspective of this energetic aspect where we're getting closer to the upper chakras, we're getting to the crown chakra, that connection to source and spirit and things like that. Lion's mane does something in that field, and I felt it in that moment, and I did a little video about it because I was having this moment. So it really taught me that there's something to it from that perspective. So it's a Shen tonic. But the other one that and look, man, I can go into a whole bunch of herbs as well, but I guess these are key ones that are more available and stuff like that. But one that I've been playing around with, which I don't think is specifically a Shen tonic, and we chatted about this, before yesterday, I think, is ashwagandha. Now, ashwagandha is another Rapashani herb, which means it's a herb of longevity. It's one of the three top herbs in the Ayurvedic system. But I've noticed since I've started taking it, yes, it increases stamina, right, and reduces stress, but I can feel it's doing something to my state of well-being. I've noticed that with certain things that I've been doing, like in performance, I'm more able to stay in this kind of like Zen connected space where I'm focused only on the task at hand. My visualization skills go up and I can just translate that through to the body. And I mean, that's just what I'm utilizing it for. But I think that ashwagandha very likely has some Shen qualities to it. But, it's difficult to actually explain what is Shen and what is Jing because they feed into each other. So if you get calm, you're going to get Jing. If you build Jing, you're going to get calm. So in terms of what herbs nourish them, it's but you know what? I've actually got, because otherwise I'm just going to get so massively off. I actually have here in front of me, so this is Ron Teagarn's work. So these are actually all the Shen tonics. So we've got reishi up here, wild reishi in particular, because the thing is wild foods, right? And there's actually Shen qualities to Sharga too, even though it's really more Jing, right? Because it's wild, right? Not even cultivated. Like wild reishi is extremely rare. You can get wild cultivated reishi, which is what we have, which means that it mimics the environment. It's grown on a log wood and stuff. It's grown in a forest. But when you have something that's like wild, it's just an X factor that's beyond that. Spirit Poria, that's another one. Pearls there. Ginseng, right? Like ginseng is an interesting one, man, because ginseng can go from being Jing to Qi, right, to Shen. It's primarily Qi, but it depends on the age of it. And once it reaches a certain age, because a lot of people have difficulty with ginseng, and I don't suggest you go and just buy any ginseng because it's usually like 1-2 years old maybe. It's way, way too young, right, and way too young. Right, the difference being one, like young as in, does that make sense?
Young.
I shouldn't have said that. So young as in not old, and yang as in the opposite of yin or yang. Oh, yeah. But you'd say young. But anyway, so it's way too yang, and it's also too young. But when it reaches a certain age, it actually starts to cultivate Shen qualities too. In fact, it's so amazing that when it reaches another age beyond that, it will actually switch off its gene to die. And so it will not die. And it glows in the dark. One of the ways they used to hunt for it is they would get like bows and arrows and they would shoot like bows, like say off across a chasm or whatever where they saw it with like colored flags in it so they could find them in the morning. But they would literally look for this glowing kind of food. So, yeah. And look, there's a whole bunch of other ones, but I think it's probably going to get confusing if I start listing all of them.
That's a good list.
Yeah, although this one does need a notable mention because it's hassling me to talk about it. All right, so wild asparagus, if anyone's ever seen Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, all right, so Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon was like this martial arts movie that came out about 10 or so years ago, and the way that they like, and it's looking at kind of almost like the Chinese equivalent of what we would think of as like the Arthurian, Avalonian type times. So it's where there was still magic and Taoism and stuff like that within, obviously fighting and all that sort of crazy. But the way that they would sort of run is that they'd run and they could kind of almost fly. And I remember when I saw that movie, I was like, I used to have dreams like this when I was a kid. And the Taoist immortals that supposedly live in the mountains of China have been consuming wild asparagus, and they say that it makes their spirit so light that they can fly. One thing that definitely does happen to some people when they consume asparagus root, particularly if it's wild asparagus root, is they'll actually have flying dreams. So it's actually releasing stuff from your psyche in terms of, what's holding you down, baggage, really, ultimately. So those are my picks for Shen herbs.
That is awesome. I literally, as soon as we get off this podcast, I'm going to make a brew of Sharga and go for a walk in nature.
Nice.
Was there anything else that you feel like we need to cover to give people a good picture of mushrooms, tonic herbs, adaptogens, anything else that we've missed?
I mean, we didn't talk massively, except on a cursory level, I guess, about the immune properties of mushrooms. I think in this day and age, there's like so much overemphasis on panic around sickness, which was already prevalent, sterilization and things like that. Recognize your body's intelligent. Recognize that you can build your immune system. And if you build your immune system, you'll be strong. Up until 2019, which is why, like, I don't have a proper answer about the celery in term, or the medical medium stuff, because for the first time in a long time, my immune system took a dive. And so last year I spent rebuilding it. But for years and years, I didn't get sick. I didn't get tired. I just didn't get sick. And you don't have to get sick. And that doesn't mean that sickness is a bad thing. Sometimes your body needs to throw something off, and that's okay. But especially for people who are so chronically sick, so chronically tired, and they've got brain fog and they've got digestive issues and all these sort of things, like, take heart and like work on building your immune system. And one of the cool things about mushrooms is its primary focus is its immunological benefits in those long chains. We were talking about those polysaccharides primarily. I think I put a lot of my health down to the fact that I have taken these mushrooms for such a long period of time. They've just sort of become, like, it's weird. I don't like think about taking them. I'd just be like, what else can I not put with them? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just automatic. But ever since I've taken them, I just haven't had issues at all.
Yeah, that's a really valid point, actually. Is there a downside to mixing a couple of these mushrooms together in a particular brew, or is it best having them on their own?
No, there actually isn't. Like, from a taste perspective, like I made this one where I mixed all of what I call the big four, which is Sharga, Cordyceps, lion's mane, and reishi. And I don't know, the taste doesn't work. But, like, for example, we've got one, what is it called now? It used to be called mushroom. I think it's called mushroom immunity, but it's called immune defense. So Paul Stamets, who I talked about earlier on, he has kind of coined this term, a host defense. So if you can imagine that there's a whole bunch of, like, and this is just an illustration, but imagine you've got a whole bunch of literal doors or gates to your immune system, and one particular mushroom opens one gate and the other mushroom opens another gate and the other mushroom opens another gate, et cetera, et cetera. When you combine a whole bunch of them together, you get what's called a host defense. So instead of opening one or two or three gates, you're opening all of them. And then it becomes very much focused on your immune system, but actually also your brain. It still works on that sense. But let's say if you want to take reishi as a Shen herb, right, as a calmative, as a spirit thing, as a meditative thing. And by the way, lion's mane also, right, this was the other clue. Sorry, just quickly folding back to the Shen thing. In its Japanese, its name is Yamabushi Shiitake, which means those who sleep at mountains. And the Yamabushi are like these crazy monks who like meditate under waterfalls and in like rooms full of chili pepper. So they do kind of the Dave Goggins equivalent, actually, of monk work, but it's like lion's mane enhances mood. And yeah, so you know what? In some ways, I kind of should have known this. I think I just need to have that experience. But So when you're taking the lion's mane or the reishi or the Sharga or whatever in this host event, you're obviously taking a much smaller amount, but from an immune perspective, right, you're going to get more bang for your buck when you're combining all of these mushrooms together, right? And the more that you put together, the stronger it gets. In fact, at one point I was trying to compete with Paul. Before we went certified organic, we had access to a lot of mushrooms, some of which sadly we couldn't bring in, not because they weren't good, but because they weren't certified organic, including birch polypore and agaricon. And I was trying to like make the most amount of mushrooms in a mixture. And I think at one point we got it up to, I think it was like 19. It was 19. So I didn't quite get there because I think Paul had it at 22. But, this is including things like oyster mushroom, which are beneficial. Like they definitely have it. But I still put them more in the gourmet frontier and less in the medicinal one. That's why when we were talking before about adaptogens, what's a true adaptogen, I want to make sure that we're going based on what's researched and strongly researched rather than just arbitrarily applied because some XYZ has been found about this. So, man, you can definitely do that.
And if I was making a brew, how much, like what's considered a larger than normal dose of chaga, for example, like in terms of like teaspoons?
Okay, so I guess I've got to be really careful of what I say in response to this because for people starting out, like there's a reason why we've put a dose on there because they work. It's not like something else you're going to get where it's going to be like, yeah, whatever. So that's why, you start with half a teaspoon. Well, to give you an idea, like I think I put like a tablespoon into my smoothie before. And I could put more in, but it starts to throw the taste probably a little bit. With the host defense idea, both me and my business partner, Dan, we managed to figure out how to push back cold sores using which anyone who gets cold sores knows that's nigh on impossible. So once it's on, that's it, game over. But we actually start pushing them back. Now, we were taking like, I think, up to 3 tablespoons over the course of a day of immune defense to do that, or mushroom immunity, whatever, right? Of this like host complex to do that. I don't really recommend that people do that off the bat unless they're totally okay with that there might be some ramifications. None of these are dangerous ramifications, but, I can't recommend something so that someone comes back to me and then goes, oh, you told me to do this and da-da-da-da. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm a little bit more experimental. It's like cordyceps, man. Don't take high doses of cordyceps unless you want to stay at home because it will purge your liver, right, through your digestive tract, and you will go liquid. 100%. That's not a negative thing. It's just that, like it really depends on the lifestyle that you live. So, yeah.
Hey, this has been super informative. I feel like I've just been taken on a beautiful journey. So thank you so much for sharing your amazing knowledge. I also feel like we could do about 3 more podcasts. Yeah.
I actually do have a whole bunch of show and tell stuff, which I didn't even really get into, man. Like if you want to do another one, I'm more than happy to get into more of the energetics of the mushrooms. Definitely.
Cool. If people want to learn more about you or find Teelixir, if they want to purchase some mushrooms, where do they go?
We've got a site called Teelixir.com. Right, so like basically they're available for purchase there. We're also like in health food stores all around the country. We're on Instagram and Facebook and like various other forms of social media. So check us out on that. We've got a whole host of material, as I said before. Like there's a whole bunch of blog articles that were written by Daniel, who's an amazing writer. He really clarifies things. And there's ones on Pearl, there's ones on reishi, benefits to reishi, how to get better sleep, how to get more energy. all sorts of things like that. There's also some videos, I believe, on like our YouTube channel. I'm assuming just look up Teelixir. That's where we're at. So, yeah.
Awesome. Mate, thank you so much for coming on. It's been awesome. And we'll see you soon.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me, man. Really appreciate it.